In the summer of 1901, 4 people from the same family died inside 6 weeks. Same house, same nurse. Every one of them was healthy in July. By the middle of August, every one of them was in the ground. Nobody called the police. The nurse helped plan the funerals. You already know what a serial killer looks like. You've seen the photograph. A man in a booking room under a bad light. A van, a crawl space, a stretch of woods off a state highway where somebody's dog found something. That picture is real. It's also incomplete, and the part that's missing has been sitting in plain sight for 120 years. About 1 in every 6 serial killers is a woman. And here's the number that should bother you more than that one. Their crimes go undetected for longer. Not because they're smarter, because of where they stand when they do it. A man who kills strangers leaves bodies in places that belong to nobody. A woman who kills the people around her leaves bodies in a cemetery with a headstone and a preacher, and a line of neighbors carrying casserole dishes up the front walk. One of those looks like a crime scene. The other one looks like a funeral. Now, before we go further, there's a name you're waiting for. Aileen Wuornos. 7 men, shot along the highways of Central Florida between November of 1989 and November of 1990. A .22 caliber revolver. Bodies dumped in scrub off the interstate. She was arrested in January of 1991, convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder, and executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on the 9th of October, 2002. She was 46. She refused a last meal. She is the most famous female serial killer this country has ever produced. There's an Oscar-winning film about her. There are 3 documentaries. Ask any American to name a woman who killed more than once, and this is the name you get. And usually, it's the only name you get. So look at what she actually did. Strangers, a firearm, outdoors, men she had never met before that night, in a car, on the side of a road. She killed the way a man kills, and she was caught in 14 months. That's not a coincidence, and it's not an insult to her. It's the whole point. Aileen Wuornos is the one you remember because she is the one who behaved the way you already expected. She fits the photograph. She got a movie because her story is shaped like a movie. The 6 women you're about to meet did not get movies. Between them, they operated for 6 years, 9 years, 15 years, 27 years. They killed the people who trusted them most, in the places those people slept, and in almost every single case, the thing that finally stopped them was not a detective. Keep that in the back of your mind as we go. Count the police. See how far you get. Set Wuornos aside. She's the exception. Here's the rule. The first one is the nurse from the summer of 1901. Her name was Jane Toppan, and the people who worked with her called her Jolly Jane. She earned it. She laughed easily. She never complained about a shift, and the doctors who hired her thought she was one of the best private nurses in Massachusetts. Wealthy families in New England competed for her. She was born Honora Kelly in Boston to Irish immigrants. Her mother died of tuberculosis when she was small. Her father put her in an orphanage. A family named Toppan took her in as an indentured servant, gave her their name, and invented a past for her. By the 1880s, she had trained as a nurse, and she was very, very good at it. She was also, by her own later account, running experiments. Morphine and atropine. One drug slows the body down, the other speeds it up. Used together in the right sequence, a patient will drift out of consciousness and then come back over and over for hours. Toppan would sit on the edge of the bed and take them down and bring them back and take them down again. And then, at some point of her choosing, she would stop bringing them back. Understand what that means about the people she nursed who lived. Some of them woke up in the morning and thanked her. She did this for roughly 15 years, and nobody noticed. And the reason nobody noticed is not complicated. She worked inside private homes. There was no supervisor. There were no charts anyone would audit. And when an elderly patient under nursing care died in 1898, the death certificate said what death certificate said in 1898, which was almost anything. Then she went to Cape Cod. In July of 1901, Jane Toppan was hired by the Davis family at their summer house in Calumet. Mattie Davis died on the 4th of July. Her daughter Genevieve Gordon died on the 31st. Alden Davis died on the 8th of August. His other daughter, Mary Gibbs, the one everyone called Minnie, died on the 15th. 4 people in 6 weeks in a house by the water, in the middle of vacation season. The family grieved. The doctors signed the papers, and Captain Paul Gibbs, who was Minnie's father-in-law, refused to accept it. He was not a policeman. He was an old sailor who had just watched an entire healthy family disappear, and he did the arithmetic that nobody with a badge was doing. He found a toxicologist. He got a judge to order the bodies exhumed. And on a summer morning, in a barn near the cemetery, they opened Mattie and Genevieve and sent the samples up to Harvard. The first results came back arsenic. That should have ended it, and it almost did, because in 1901, arsenic was also an ingredient in embalming fluid. The finding was worthless. The case was about to collapse. It was Captain Gibbs who told them to look for morphine and atropine. A civilian with no medical training corrected the forensic hypothesis, and he was right. Police arrested Jane Toppan in Amherst, New Hampshire, on the 29th of October, 1901. A druggist in Falmouth testified he had sold her morphine before the deaths. She was formally charged with 12 murders. In custody, she confessed to 31. Investigators believed the real number might be over 100. Her trial ran 8 hours. The jury took 20 minutes, found not guilty by reason of insanity, committed for life to the Taunton Asylum, where she lived another 36 years and died in 1938 at the age of 84. She never took it back. She told her doctors that her ambition was to have killed more helpless people than any man or woman who had ever lived. And in the asylum, at the end, she developed one particular fear that she could not shake. She stopped eating. She was afraid somebody was poisoning her food. The second one gave the town a stained glass window. Amy Archer-Gilligan ran a home for the elderly on Prospect Street in Windsor, Connecticut. The neighbors called her Sister Amy. She was a small widow with a teenage daughter. She was in church every Sunday. She was active in town affairs, and when the parish needed money for the building fund, she gave. Fewer than 10 boarders lived in the house at any one time. People trusted her with their parents. Between 1907 and 1910, 12 residents died. Between 1911 and 1916, 48 died. 48 people, out of a house that never held more than 10 at once, in 5 years, and not one person in the state of Connecticut asked a question. There's a reason for that, and it's the most important sentence in this entire story. In 1907, there was no state regulation of nursing homes in Connecticut. None. Old people dying in a house full of old people was not a fact that required an explanation. It was just Tuesday. She bought arsenic from the local druggist in quantities that raised eyebrows even then. She said she had rats. And when she wanted more than she could reasonably explain, she sent the boarders to buy it for her. Read that again. The residents of the home walked down to the drugstore in her name and carried it back. Her second husband, Michael Gilligan, married her in 1913 and was dead 3 months later. His will left everything to her and nothing to his 4 adult sons. Investigators would later determine the will was a forgery written in her handwriting. Then, in May of 1916, a 61-year-old boarder named Franklin Andrews spent the morning working on the lawn around the house. Witnesses said he looked to be in perfect health. He died the same day. His sister was named Nellie Pierce. She went to the local district attorney with what she suspected, and he brushed her off. So she went to the newspaper. At the same time, a Windsor man named Carlin Gosley, who wrote the obituaries for the Hartford Courant, had been noticing that he was writing an awful lot of obituaries for one address. Every drugstore in the state was required by law to keep a poison register. He went and read them. He found her purchases. On the 9th of May, 1916, the Hartford Courant published the story. They called the Archer home a murder factory. After that, the police could not keep sitting on it. They exhumed 5 bodies: Michael Gilligan, Franklin Andrews, Alice Godey, Charles Smith, Maud Howard Lynch. All 5 had been poisoned, some with arsenic, some with strychnine. A witness testified that the contents of Franklin Andrews' stomach held enough arsenic to kill 6 strong men. She was arrested on the 8th of May, 1916. Her first trial ran 4 weeks in the summer of 1917 and ended in a conviction and a sentence of death by hanging. Her lawyers appealed and won a new trial. The second one, in 1919, ended in second-degree murder and life imprisonment. In 1924, she was moved to the state hospital for the insane in Middletown, and she stayed there until she died on the 23rd of April, 1962, at the age of 88. One more thing about Sister Amy. In 1917, the year of her trial, the Connecticut legislature introduced a bill to regulate nursing homes. 48 people had to die in one house before the state agreed to look. And in 1941, a playwright named Joseph Kesselring came to Connecticut, read the court records of this case, and turned it into a Broadway comedy. It ran for over 1,000 performances. Cary Grant starred in the film. You've probably seen it. It's called Arsenic and Old Lace. America turned this house into a joke inside 25 years. The third one watched from the porch. On the morning of the 11th of November, 1988, 3 men walked into the backyard of a blue and white Victorian at 1426 F Street in Sacramento, California, carrying shovels. 2 of them were homicide detectives. The third was a federal probation agent. Less than a mile away sat the state capitol. The woman who ran the house came out onto the second-floor porch in her housecoat and watched them dig. She was not a suspect. She was 69 years old, silver-haired, soft-spoken, and everybody in the social services network in that city considered her a godsend. Her name was Dorothea Puente, and she took in the people nobody else would take: the elderly, the mentally ill, alcoholics, men and women who had been sleeping outdoors. She helped them set up their Social Security accounts. She cooked real meals. She sent them to bed with warm milk. Understand her value to the system. Sacramento had nowhere to put these people. She had somewhere. She also had a criminal record. In 1982, she was convicted of theft and forgery for drugging 4 elderly people to steal their benefit checks. She served her time. She got out in 1985. She reopened the boarding house. Nobody stopped her because nobody was watching. Because who exactly do you think is auditing a boarding house for homeless alcoholics? The first hole they dug that morning turned up nothing but soft dirt. In the second one, the probation agent felt his blade hit something solid about 3 feet down. He scraped the soil back, and what he found looked, at first, like a tree root. The shovel wouldn't move it. So one of the detectives climbed down into the hole. By the end of the day, they had found 7 bodies: Leona Carpenter, Dorothy Miller, Alvaro Montoya, Benjamin Fink, James Gallup, Vera Faye Martin, Betty Palmer. Prosecutors would eventually connect her to 9 deaths in total and estimate that she had collected over $87,000 in benefit checks belonging to people who were already underneath her garden. Some of it went on a facelift. Here's the part that matters. The reason those men were in that yard at all had nothing to do with the house. It had to do with one person. Alvaro Montoya went by Bert. He was a man with schizophrenia and an intellectual disability, and a social worker named Judy Moise had placed him at the boarding house. She used to come by to check on him. When he stopped being there, Puente told her he had gone to Mexico. Judy Moise did not believe it, and she did not let it go, and she filed a missing persons report on a homeless man with a mental illness, which is a category of person this country loses every day without a phone call. They found Bert Montoya in the yard. Now watch what Dorothea Puente did while the digging was going on. She was still not a suspect. She asked the detectives if she could walk down to the cafe on the corner and get a cup of coffee. They said yes. She got on a bus to Los Angeles. She was gone 5 days. And she was recognized in a bar by an elderly man who had seen her face on the evening news, and he picked up the phone and called the police. An old man in a bar turned in the woman who killed old people. She was arrested on the 16th of November, 1988. The trial was moved to Monterey County because Sacramento was saturated. It opened in February of 1993. Ran with over 130 witnesses and more than 3,000 exhibits, and the jury deliberated for 24 days, which was a record. They convicted her on 3 counts. They deadlocked on 6. On the 10th of December, 1993, she was sentenced to life without parole. She died in prison in 2011 at the age of 82, still saying she was innocent. She said her boarders died of natural causes. The 4th one went to every funeral. Velma Barfield lived in Cumberland County, North Carolina, and by 1978 she had buried a lot of people she loved. She wept at the services. People who were there said the grief looked completely real to them. She was addicted to prescription tranquilizers and painkillers. To pay for that, she stole from the people she was closest to and from the elderly people she was hired to look after, forging checks and taking out loans in their names. And then she gave them rat poison. The explanation she gave in court is the coldest sentence in this entire episode, and I want to be precise about it because she said it herself and the jury heard it. She said she was not trying to kill them. She said she was trying to make them sick enough that they would need her to take care of them, which would buy her time to find another job and put the money back before anyone noticed. She poisoned them so that they would need a nurse, and then she was the nurse. The arsenic did not cooperate. Her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor, was a widowed tobacco farmer. He got sick in the winter of 1978, and he got worse, and she took care of him, and he died. Before him, Dolly Edwards, an elderly woman related to Taylor. John Henry Lee, an elderly man who was paying her as a housekeeper and caregiver. And in 1974, her own mother, Lily Bullard, in whose name she had taken out a loan. Her late husband, Thomas Barfield, was exhumed later, and there was arsenic in him too. She denied that one until the day she died. She was linked to 7 deaths. she was convicted of one. And the person who brought her down was an anonymous tipster who called the police to say that Velma had killed others the same way she killed Stuart Taylor. The tipster was her sister. She was arrested on the 13th of May, 1978, convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to death in December of that year. North Carolina had a problem with that in the most literal sense. There was no death row for women in that state. She was the only one. So they held her at Central Prison in Raleigh in a unit built for prisoners who were escape risks and prisoners with severe mental illness because there was nowhere else to put a woman who had been sentenced to die. She was there 6 years. She became a born-again Christian, and she started doing ministry work with the other inmates and with the guards, and it does not appear to have been a performance. She wrote letters to Governor Jim Hunt asking him to commute her sentence. Christians all over the country took up her case, including Billy and Ruth Graham. Governor Hunt said no. At 2 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of November, 1984, Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection at Central Prison. She was 52. She was the first woman put to death in the United States since 1962. The first woman executed anywhere in the country after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, and the first woman in American history to die by lethal injection. She did not ask for a special last meal. She asked for a Coca-Cola and a bag of cheese doodles. Her final statement was an apology to every family involved and a thank you to the people who had stood by her. The fifth one laughed. Nannie Doss was born Nancy Hazel in Blue Mountain, Alabama in 1905, and she wanted to be in love. That is not a joke, and it is not a metaphor. It is the confirmed motive in the case file. She read romance magazines, True Romance, and the ones like it, with the cover paintings and the promises. She married 5 times across 4 states, Alabama, North Carolina, Kansas, and Oklahoma, and 4 of those husbands died. She also buried her own mother, Louisa, and a sister, and a mother-in-law. 27 years of this. 1927 to 1954. The reason it ran that long is jurisdiction. Every time a husband died, a coroner in one state signed a piece of paper and filed it in a county courthouse where nobody had ever heard of the last 3 husbands, in 3 other states, in 3 other filing cabinets. Nobody was assembling the picture because there was nobody whose job it was to assemble the picture. She met the last 2 through Lonely Hearts advertisements. Strangers writing letters. Samuel Doss was the 5th, a Nazarene minister, 58 years old, who married her in July of 1954. He was a serious man, and he disapproved of her romance magazines. He told her to stop reading them. In September, he went into the hospital in Tulsa with a severe digestive complaint. They treated him. He improved. They released him on the 5th of October, 1954. He died on the 12th. His doctor could not understand it. He had watched this man get better in a hospital bed for a month, and then the man went home and was dead in a week. So the doctor went to the widow and asked her permission to perform an autopsy. She gave it. The autopsy found arsenic, not traces, a massive amount. Nannie Doss was arrested in October of 1954, and when they questioned her, she confessed to killing 4 of her 5 husbands. She confessed on one condition. She wanted to keep her romance magazine. That is verified. That is in the record. She traded 4 murders for a magazine. Reporters gave her a nickname because of what she did in the interview room. Every time she described how a husband had died, she laughed. Not a nervous laugh. She giggled. They called her the Giggling Granny, and when the judge handed her a life sentence in May of 1955, she seemed delighted about it. Oklahoma did not pursue the death penalty. The prevailing attitude of the time was that you did not execute a woman. She told the investigators the truth about why, and it holds up better than any theory anyone has offered since. She said money had nothing to do with it, insurance payouts notwithstanding. She said she was searching for the perfect mate, the real romance of life. She died of leukemia in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in 1965. There is one man in this story who walked away. Charlie Braggs married her in 1921. He divorced her in 1928. He is the only one of the five who left on his own feet, and he left because he left. And now the last one, and the one nobody has ever finished. Her name was Belle Gunness. She was born Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth in Norway in 1859. She came to Chicago in the 1880s, and by the early 1900s, she owned a farm on McClung Road outside La Porte, Indiana. She was a big woman, close to 6 feet, and neighbors described her as hard-working and cold. Her first husband died. There was no autopsy. Relatives said afterward that his symptoms had looked like poisoning. She collected the insurance. Her second husband, Peter Gunness, died in December of 1902 from a blow to the head, and she told investigators that a meat grinder had fallen off a shelf onto him. The coroner used the word suspicious at the inquest. It was ruled an accident anyway. She collected the insurance on that one too. Then she started placing advertisements. She ran them in 3 Norwegian-language weekly newspapers across the Midwest, looking for a reliable man to become a partner in her farm. Prosperous widow, good land, companionship. Men wrote back. We will never know how many. What we know is what she wrote to them. She told them to sell everything they owned and bring only cash. And she told them to keep the move a secret. To one of them she wrote, "Come prepared to stay forever." Think about the architecture of that. A man in South Dakota liquidates his farm, tells nobody where he is going, gets on a train, and arrives in a town where not one person has ever heard his name. There is no one in La Porte who knows he exists. There is no one back home who knows where he went. He has been erased on both ends before he ever knocks on her door. A carpenter who did occasional work at the farm noticed something in the house. There were trunks in there, more than a dozen of them. One of the men was named Archer-Gilligan, a Norwegian farmer from Aberdeen, South Dakota. He arrived in January of 1908 and stayed 2 weeks. He had money wired from his bank in Aberdeen to the First National Bank in La Porte. The two of them walked in together to cash it. The bank suggested he leave some of it on deposit for safety. Andrew's own instinct was the same. She took all of it in cash. He was gone the next day. On the 28th of April, 1908, the farmhouse burned to the ground. When the fire was out, searchers went through what was left and brought out the household. Among the remains was the body of an adult woman, and everyone assumed it was Belle. There was one problem with that. The body had no head. Without a head, nobody could prove who she was. And people who had known Belle Gunness looked at that body and said out loud that it was too small. Archer-Gilligan's brother, Asel, came down from South Dakota. He searched the ruins and found nothing. So he and the farmhand, a man named Joe Maxon, who had survived the fire, went out to a corner of the property where Belle had been burying garbage back in March, and they started to dig. They found Andrew in a gunny sack. The county sheriff took over, and the digging went on for days, and by the time it stopped, there were at least 11 more people out of that ground. and the LaPorte County Historical Society puts the number at 13. Most of them were never identified because most of them had done exactly what she asked. They had sold everything, told nobody, and come prepared to stay. 15,000 people came to watch. They came by horse and buggy, by interurban train, by automobile if they had one. The sheriff conducted the excavation in front of them like a county fair. Her hired man, Ray Lamphere, went on trial that November. He had wanted to marry her. He had been jealous of Archer-Gilligan. She had fired him, then charged him with trespassing when he came back for his own belongings, then started telling the town he was dangerous. The jury convicted him of arson and acquitted him of murder. He died in prison, and before he died, he told a minister that he had watched Archer-Gilligan die, that he had asked Belle for money to keep quiet, and that he had helped her bury bodies and helped her get away after the fire. That is one man's word, delivered secondhand, with nothing behind it. But it never went away because of the head. In 2007, a forensic anthropologist named Andrea Simmons and a professor named Stephen Naraki, both from the University of Indianapolis, got permission from a descendant of Belle's sister and exhumed the headless skeleton from Forest Home Cemetery outside Chicago, where it had been lying for 99 years. They tried to pull DNA from envelopes Belle had sealed with her own tongue when she was writing to the men she was inviting. The flaps were still stuck down. It didn't work. So they found a living woman in Norway, 5 generations removed, on an unbroken female line, which meant her mitochondrial DNA should have been effectively identical to Belle's. They ran the comparison. The result was inconclusive. That's where it stands. There is no answer. Here's what I want you to sit with. That laboratory had the skeleton. It had a living blood relative. It had 100 years of forensic science that 1898 and 1908 did not have, and it had every reason in the world to want a clean result. And it still could not tell anyone who was buried in that grave. So, count the police, a sea captain who hired his own toxicologist, a dead man's sister who got laughed out of the district attorney's office and went to a newspaper instead, a man who wrote obituaries and got suspicious about how many he was writing, a social worker who filed a report on a homeless man that nobody else would have filed, a doctor who asked a widow for permission and got it, a sister who called an anonymous tip line on her own sister, a brother who came in from another state with a shovel. That's the list. That's who stopped them. Not one institution in this entire hour did its job on its own. The nursing home was unregulated. The county coroners never spoke to each other. The boarding house had already been prosecuted once and reopened. The death certificate said whatever the doctor felt like writing that afternoon. These women were not hiding. Every one of them was standing in the middle of a room in daylight, holding a cup. The system was built to look at strangers. They were never strangers. And somewhere in a cemetery outside Chicago, in a zinc-lined casket, there is a woman with no name and no head. And 118 years later, we still do not know whether the person who put her there died in that fire, or bought a train ticket,